Hey Ari, how's it going, brother?
What's up, Foti? What's going on?
Here we are, another segment of our sipping sessions. And
The
as the
sip
weather
clip,
continues to get warm, we're going to actually explore sparkles and bubbles today.
my favorite.
Yes, it's a category that's been overlooked for quite some time, but lately, I got to say that there's a huge interest in sparkling wines, and it's not just for popping bottles and toasting. Sparkling wine has a more meaningful reason to be at the table. Um, I'm sure you've had sparkling wines yourself. I'm sure
Oh
you've
yeah.
been sipping on them. I'm sure you've done bottle service at the nightclub, popping bottles and passing it around.
Well, I'll tell you real quick. One of my favorite memories of one of the wines we're going to drink today, Cava, is going to Tapeo's um,
Newberry Street,
on Newberry Street, and we'd go as a group, and we would
yep,
always have to order the Cava, and it would come in that like funky
correct.
uh, pitcher with a
Yes,
thin nose, and then you'd have to start drinking, and then you'd
from
have
the
to lift
spout.
it up, drinking it, and it would
Well,
spill all over.
nice. Well, that's your fond memories of Cava, right? And I'm sure everyone has some kind of fond memory with sparkling wine, but um, it's actually in my opinion, a serious production. And believe it or not, sparkling wine actually happened by accident.
Hmm.
If you don't already know, I'll give you real quickly the background that occurred 400 years ago. A gentleman by the name of Dom Perignon, who was a monk at a monastery, created sparkling wine by chance. And what actually had happened was he was the resident winemaker at the monastery. And one season after he harvested his grapes and he brought them back to the facility or to the winery, he began producing his wine. Uh, Wine was fermented, went to bottling, and it happened to be he just finished bottling all his white wine, and it happened to be unusually colder than normal. I think this was in the fall time. So what happened was it was almost freezing temperatures at that moment. So any unfermented sugar yeast that was left in the bottle sort of froze, if that makes any sense. And then he put his wine away, not knowingly. And then fast forward to the springtime, it happened to be unusually warm, warmer than normal, and that huge influx of temperature uh, awoke the sugar and yeast, and they connected again. But they connected so quickly at such a high temperature, it created combustion, and all of a sudden, all of his bottles in his cellar started to explode one by one.
Oh man.
And he was freaked out, had no idea what's going on. To their awe, they just was like, what happened? And they basically did some more research, and they figured out that when sugar and yeast, unfermented sugar and yeast that's in wine, if once they activate and connect again, it starts to brew. So it goes into like a secondary fermentation, which creates the bubbles. So that was the birth of sparkling wine. Actually, through that process, they perfected it, and then they created different approaches to it. But it did
I, I
develop.
I wonder what that first batch tasted like.
That's a good question. I'm sure it's documented somewhere, but in order for them to continue it, it must have been appealing because
Yeah.
otherwise they would never happen again.
It's
But
like every great invention happens by accident. It's like
pretty much,
if
right?
you believe in fate or in like karma or any of that stuff, it's like some people just have like this strike of, call it luck or call it something, but all the
Or
greatest
or de-
things.
or de- or destiny, because
Yeah.
obviously for this to happen, it had to happen at the right time, at the right place, at the right moment, and it all connected together, and boom, here you are.
And
And
luckily his name was Dom Perignon, because that worked.
right, so the birth of sparkling wine did actually happen in Champagne, France. It is the most respected, well protected wine region of the world. For many years, there were different producers using the term loosely champagne on their packaging. And it wasn't until the last couple of decades, the French put an end to that. And in order for a sparkling wine to have the term champagne on its label, it has to come from Champagne, France. It has to be made by the 3 allowed grapes to be grown in Champagne, France, and those grapes are Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, a red grape, and another red grape called Pinot Meunier. Those are the 3 grapes that are allowed. And considering some other factors in the requirements, once you fulfill those requirements, then you can put on your label Champagne. Otherwise, there are other terms that you can use.
I did not know about the red grapes.
Correct. So then you say to yourself, everyone thinks it's white. So what happens is they remove the skins of the red grapes before production, or if they, I'm sure you've seen sparkling rosé. If they decide to make a rosé champagne, is they leave the skins in, which we discussed in some of our previous segments on rosé, is that they leave the skins in for a short amount of time to make sparkling rosé as well. So back to production of sparkling wines. So this method that we just discussed that happened by accident in Champagne, France, is known as bottle fermented sparkler. So there's what's known as a bottle fermented sparkler, and then we're going to also explore another sparkler known as a tank fermented sparkler, which we're going to choose a selection from Prosecco. And the skinny on the differences between the two. So bottle fermented sparkler is basically, to keep it very simple, is that this producer who's making a bottle fermented sparkler, which is from Barcelona, Spain, their sparklers are known as Cava. And pretty much, if we go back to the vineyards, the grapes are harvested, they're brought back to the winery, the grapes are pressed, goes into a vat for fermentation. It becomes white wine first, and then it goes into bottling. They let the wine settle for a little bit of time. After the wine has settled, they uncork each bottle, and they inject small amounts of additional sugar and yeast right into the bottle at the right temperature, and that creates the brewing process, and it goes into a secondary fermentation. That's where the bubbles begin, and then once they reach the level of bubbles that they want, then they recork it, and they let it settle for a little bit more of time, and out it goes into the market. So basically, the bubbles happen in the bottle here.
Wow.
That's a bottle fermented sparkler. That's what was created in Champagne, France, and that method has been shared across the world with other producers. So some of the terms, so this producer here does label that it's bottle fermented. Some other producers, to let you know if this is, a production that happened in the bottle, they can use terms like method champagne or method champenois. You might see on bottles. That basically means it's made in the same fashion as they do in Champagne, France. Okay. Others don't choose to do it unless you read up about it. The second sparkler that we're going to discuss is tank fermented sparkler. And we chose a tank fermented sparkler from Prosecco. Prosecco is an area in the northern parts of Italy, in the Veneto area. So Prosecco is an area that makes sparkling wine. And the grape that is allowed in Prosecco that makes sparkling wine is called Glera, Glera. That's the grape that's used to make Prosecco. Most folks think that Prosecco is a wine.
Is it white?
Prosecco is an area close to outside of Venice.
Oh, I'm saying, is the Glera grape a white grape?
A white grape. It's a white grape. And here, what happens? The process is just a little different than what happens in bottle fermented sparkler. So the same scenario. The grapes are harvested. They're brought back to the winery. They're pressed, and then the juice goes into a huge stainless steel vessel. And then what happens is the wine ferments in this vessel. Once it's fermented, right before it goes to bottling, they actually inject the sugar and yeast into the actual tank so that the whole tank becomes carbonated. And then once it becomes carbonated, then they go to bottling, and then they cork it. So bubbles in the bottle, bubbles in the tank on the Prosecco. So I always get the question, so what's the difference between the two as far as like what to expect from textures and flavors? Typically, sparklers that are made in the bottle, you might get more of a drier, bitter element, and sparkling wines that happen in the tank usually produce a more effervescent, fruitier selection that's a little more inviting. So why don't we crack these bottles, Ari, and then let's give these a try. And if you notice, most sparklers classically have a thicker foil around the neck, followed by a enlarged cork and a wire cage for additional protection, because the truth is there's a lot of pressure in these bottles and they can be a little dangerous if the cork goes flying. I'm not sure if that's ever happened to you before. So there's a little tab. You bring down the tab. Rule of thumb is 6 twists to the left to get it loose. And then what I recommend is don't remove the cage completely, because these corks have a thin film of wax on them. And if it's really cold, they're very slippery. And that's where your hand can that's where the cork can kind of slide out of your hand. I leave the wire cage on for additional protection, just for some grip. And then what I do is I give it a firm grip at the top, and then I just slowly nudge the cork and let the pressure of the bottle push the cork by itself. So I give it some time. We want a soft release that we refer to as a soft kiss, and hopefully I can kind of accomplish that.
Move.
And then we pour in these little narrow glasses known as flutes. They're recommended
I unfortunately
because...
do not have a flute. I just have a little short little glass.
Well, I was just going to mention that it's just preference. It doesn't mean you have to. But the narrower the glass is, the longer the bubbles stay around. And one thing about sparkling wine is that it's one of the selections that you want to serve very cold. The colder, the better, because the colder, the better for the bubbles. If sparkling wines are served slightly warmer than they should be, then they start to fizz up a lot. And the more fizz, the more you lose the wine.
Yeah.
So it's recommended that the colder, the better, right?
Yep. And it tastes good. It tastes so good cold.
Oh yeah, ice cold. I would recommend even stick it in the freezer for about 15 minutes if you need to. Won't hurt the wine at all. All right, and then this is our Prosecco. The Prosecco we chose for this segment, whoop, that was a little harder than I wanted to be, but it's okay. We still saved it. Is from 90 Plus Cellars. We're big fans of what 90 Cellars puts out, quality and value. So we're definitely big fans of what they put out. All right, so here we go. So we're gonna start first, Ari, with the Cava from the Bone. And if you notice, a little bit of a different color. So the Cava, if you can notice, is a little bit on the darker side, or it's a little more orangey in color. And then the Prosecco is a little lighter and brighter. So, salute, or cheers. Oh. So, still, for a sparkler, it still has tartness to it. Bubbles are very soft as well. They were not as, I was expecting to be a little more sharper. Nice flavor, pretty clean finish. Just very delightful. Very easy drinking for a sparkler.
Yeah, it's smooth.
Some bottle fermented sparklers can be quite sharp and dry. Kind of get you in the back of the ear sometimes. But this is a classic traditional cava or sparkling from Spain. This is something that they consume pretty much all day long. Cavas are offered at breakfast, lunch, dinner, in between, but it's just easy enough to drink as well. All right. And then moving to our Prosecco, salute, as they say in Italy. And if you notice, the aromas are a little more prominent here in the Prosecco, a little fruitier.
A little sweeter.
Yeah, definitely. You can notice the sweetness of the grapes. You can taste the ripeness of the grape. And again,
now is that simply just a factor of adding more sugar, or is that because of the difference in how they produce it?
Good question. You would think that, right? Because the thought is that, well, we're adding sugar back into the wine, so shouldn't it technically be sweeter? But what's happening chemically is that the additional sugar and yeast is basically being eaten up. So, the sugar goes away because it gets converted into alcohol. So that's where the thought gets a little confusing. If we're adding additional sugar, shouldn't the wine be sweeter? Not necessarily, depending on the chemistry of what's going on. Basically, the additional sugar is being eaten up by the yeast and vice versa, and that converts into alcohol, which makes it a drier wine. But here, they can play with the levels of sweetness here, and especially if they have good concentrated grapes, you get ripeness of the fruit, not to be confused with sweetness as like dessert sweet.
Yeah.
But here, very soft, definitely some richness, a little creamier, a little like sliver of creaminess.
They both have their own appeal. The
Right?
dryness, and the bitterness of the cava, and then the sweetness of the prosecco. But I could find two like different moods for each of these, and I like them
Absolutely.
both.
And these are still, in my opinion, good food wines. Like you can have these with a meal. Some folks are like, well, what can I have with these? I mean, sparkling wines go great with a lot of shellfish, a lot of seafood. If you're a big fan of raw oyster bars, raw bar with mussels, oysters, clams, like that's really fitting in that category of foods.
Well, I mentioned tapeos earlier, but when I was in Spain, obviously we were drinking cava like all the time, but a lot of seafood, like you said. Um, it was so, I mean, when you're on a trip and you're in a new place and it's a beautiful area and you just visited, so like everything is great. I
Right.
always wondered if that's why everything tasted so good, but it's like, now that I can think about it a little more, it's like, no, that cava's really good. And it went really well with the type of food, which we were eating mostly like seafood, shellfish, like you said, and,
Right.
some papa.
I definitely agree with what you mentioned. Environment plays a big role that is always overlooked because we're in the elements, so we're not really thinking about it. So environment is important. So if you're in that element, everything typically feels good and tastes better.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, sharp. If you want to just hang out and snack with cava or prosecco or champagne, sharp cheeses are always recommended because the saltier the cheeses, the better it works with drier, bitter wines. The bitterness of the wine is canceled out by the saltiness of the cheese. So the salt kind of polishes off that sharpness of the wine, and it kind of really brings this great balance together. Cured meats, anything that has some level of saltiness or cureness to it, really works well with sparkling wines. Definitely, it's all about balance.
Yeah.
You have a little bit of one distinct element in the wine, one distinct element of the food. They come together, and it's good to go.
Love it.
Excellent. So, for the folks that are listening, for those that haven't had sparkling wines or have been curious, we highly recommend them. They're very versatile, especially now that the weather's getting warmer and hot outside. It's a good fit to try these at the moment. And the other thing I want to point out is that both of these selections are inexpensive. When you think of champagne, you typically think of, expensive luxury, which some can be very expensive, but, cavas are, under the $15 range. The Bone happens to be one of our favorite picks. It's on our shopping cart on Urban Wine Club. So we definitely highly recommend for you to give it a try. We're going to definitely have Proseccos loaded too at some point very soon. But again, these are very inexpensive, everyday drinking wines, and we highly recommend that you try one of them at some point soon.
Absolutely.
All right,
All
brother.
right, man.
That wraps up our
So much
segment.
for sending me these selections so I could sip with you. And now,
Absolutely.
as usual, I'm going to go and polish off probably this bottle slowly. I won't
Sounds
rush
good.
into it. But
All right,
a
brother.
lot of stuff I didn't know, which, like, truthfully, was very interesting. I actually didn't know about the Dom Perignon. Like, it was a monk who actually invented it. Like, I had no idea.
Most folks don't, but most folks have spent the money for it without really knowing what's going on. For all brand recognition.
All right, cool. Thank you, Foti. Good to
My
see you.
pleasure. Cheers. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers, man.
And drink better wine.
Drink better wine. Bye-bye.